class, welcome to week 3 of EMDD 101. In this video, I want to continue talking about design thinking, which we looked at last week, but I want to kind of present another way of looking at design thinking and some of the skills that you need to be a good design thinker. I'm really excited because this week, instead of watching a bunch of videos of me, you're going to spend a lot of time actually trying to conduct some design thinking workshops and learning what they're like and kind of seeing if it's something that's for you or not. So I'm really excited about that. But let's continue our conversation about design thinking. Last week, I showed a few different drawings that showed the process of design thinking. And so we looked at design thinking by looking at what you have to do, right? The process, do this, do that, then this. And Tim Brown's model that you read about and that we looked at last week is a version of the process that kind of shows that it's not really steps, it's more spaces that you kind of go in and out of as needed. So you're going to go out into the world, look at the world, observe what people are doing, how they're thinking, what they need and want, what the problems are. And you're going to really just learn and gather the information. And then you're going to go into ideation. You're going to try to come up with ideas to solve the problem. And then you're going to go to implementation. You're going to try to find the best idea from that group and implement it. Or you can go in all directions, right? Maybe you start with inspiration, you get to ideation, you just can't come up with any ideas. Maybe you can't come up with any ideas because you don't really understand the problem that well, so you go back to inspiration. So his whole point was that it's not necessary that we follow a process exactly, but rather that we conduct work in all of these spaces and that we eventually have some kind of outcome. And if that outcome doesn't work, go back into one of the spaces. So continuing that idea of thinking about design thinking as like these spaces, I wanted to talk to you about design thinking as modes of thinking. Design thinking is called design thinking because it's all about thinking like a designer. And when we're doing that thinking, even in these spaces, we kind of have two different ways that we have to think. As design thinkers, we have to be able to think divergently and convergently. So divergently means that we are going in all directions. We're able to hold lots of different ideas in our minds at once. No constraint thinking, quantity over quality, look in all directions, hear all stories, come up with all ideas, no idea too crazy, no wrong answers sort of thinking, being able to really go in all directions and come up with as many ideas and observations as possible. Divergent thinking is represented as arrows going this way because it's really about thinking big and broad and not worrying if you're going in the right direction, right? Just thinking as big as you can, coming up with as many ideas, making as many observations. But we don't want to do that forever, right? Because we do need to go in the right direction eventually. So we also need to be good at convergent thinking. So just to review, with divergent thinking, this is that way of thinking you're probably very familiar with from brainstorming. So I wanted to show the 7 rules that IDEO, which is a design organization that practices design thinking, publishes about brainstorming. And they say that brainstorming, which is divergent thinking, requires us to defer judgment, Never say someone's idea is bad. Don't feel like you need an expert, just don't use any judgment. If someone off the street has an idea, write it down. Make everyone feel like they can contribute. They can say their idea. They can build on the ideas of others. No idea is too bad, all ideas welcome. Encourage wild ideas. So yeah, go in crazy directions, go in all kinds of directions. Don't worry if it's wacky, on track, none of that matters in divergent thinking. Build on the ideas of others, if you hear something that sounds interesting, run with it. Stay focused on the topic. So you do want to stay like on some kind of target discussion area, some sort of topic. You can go big and wide, but make sure it's around a certain topic. One conversation at a time when you're doing brainstorming. So when you're divergently thinking or observing, you're going in a lot of directions all at once, but not literally at the same time, right? Talk about one direction, then move on to the next, then move on to the next. Observe this, then observe that, then observe this. Don't try to multitask and have multiple conversations at once or observe multiple things happening at once. Be visual, write your ideas down on Post-it notes, make sketches, that sort of stuff, and then go for quantity, right? You're going for quantity over quality. Quality comes later. So you're probably really familiar with this sort of approach to brainstorming. And this is divergent thinking, going wild, going big, looking for quantity over quality. The idea here is that the more you kind of let your mind wander, the wider you go, the more you might stumble upon an interesting and new idea that hasn't been thought of or observed before. So that's why you want to just go big. Convergent thinking, we don't want to go big forever though, right? So convergent thinking, at some point in the design thinking process, we have to stop and go, okay, we did our divergence. Let's bring it back to earth. So you got to do convergent thinking. And that means applying constraints, identifying patterns, defining things. If you've just made a bunch of observations, pull out the ones that seem the most relevant. Pull out the themes. What did you observe the most? Convergent is narrowing and defining and honing in on things, developing, insights and looking at opportunities. So in that design process, you're going to diverge, then you got to converge, diverge, and then converge. So even within these spaces, inspiration, you got to go out and look, but then you got to define what you found, make a list of the insights, narrow down to the most important things that you heard and saw. Ideate, right? Come up with as many ideas, but then you got to pick one or two or three. You got to narrow it down, figure out which ones are most likely to be successful. And that's actually why implementation here is the smallest bubble, because you're not going to diverge and converge as much in that phase because you've already diverged and converged in steps 1 and 2. So by the time you get to 3, you kind of already know more narrowly the direction you need to go in. You might try a few new things, but mostly you're going to converge toward that final endpoint. So you see that represented here. This is that same set of spaces. So discover and define, ideate and iterate. That's inspiration, then ideation, and then implementation. And so what I want you guys to explore this week is the difference in those ways of thinking and how you can help others do that thinking with you, because design thinking is participatory. It's all about other people being invited into that process. So I want you to take a look at IDEO's design kit. This is a super cool website that has different methods that you can use in the various spaces of inspiration, ideation, and implementation. And what I love about it is some of the methods are all about divergence, some are all about convergence, and some are both. So in this method, for example, you can see that step 1 is come up with tons of ideas, and then you get to step 3, and step 3 is narrow it down and agree on 2. So you see that divergent and convergent thinking in a lot of their steps and methods. So I want you to go to this website and click around on some of these methods and just kind of ask yourself, is this one more divergent or is it more convergent? Or maybe it's both and it asks for one and then the other. But I think one of the biggest things that you can do as a design thinker is really understand and sort of keep in mind always those 2 different ways of thinking. What is going to be the most helpful right now? To be divergent and to defer judgment and to go wide and think big, or to be convergent and to start applying constraints and narrowing and moving toward an outcome. So the 2 ways of thinking in design thinking, divergence and convergence.